At 19 years old, she married the biggest comedy star in America and had absolutely no idea what she was walking into. Decades later, broke, alone in a London apartment, and drinking through some of the loneliest years of her life, she finally sat down in front of a tape recorder and told the whole truth. The husbands, the affairs, the violence she survived behind closed doors, and choices she made that almost nobody in Hollywood ever knew about. Some of what came out of those recordings was raw enough to stun even the people who thought they already knew her. This is the real story of Ava Gardner, the woman MGM built into a global icon, and everything she kept hidden until the very end. From a struggling tobacco farm in rural North Carolina to 3 of the most talked about marriages in the history of American celebrity, her actual life reads far darker and far more complicated than anything the studio publicity machine ever let the public see. Ava Lavinia Gardner was born on Christmas Eve, 1922, in the small farming community of Grabtown, North Carolina, the youngest of 7 children born to Jonas and Mary Gardner. Her parents worked a tobacco farm and later took in boarders once money grew tight, doing whatever it took to keep a large family fed. For the first years of her life, Ava's entire world was cotton fields, tobacco barns, and the slow, hard rhythm of rural Southern poverty. Then tragedy hit directly. A fire tore through the family's barn and tobacco operation, wiping out what little financial stability they had and forcing the family to rebuild from almost nothing. They relocated to nearby Brogdon, where her parents scraped together whatever work they could find. The Great Depression made everything harder still, and in 1938, when Ava was just 16, her father died, leaving the family to fend for itself during one of the most brutal stretches in American history. Nothing about that childhood suggested Ava Gardner would become one of the most photographed women on the planet. She was training to become a secretary, with no particular interest in acting, when a small, almost accidental event changed the entire direction of her life. Her older sister's husband, a portrait photographer named Larry Tarr, took some pictures of Ava, mainly to show off his own skill, and displayed them in the front window of his New York studio. Strangers stopped on the sidewalk just to look at them. One of those photographs eventually reached a talent scout working for MGM, who arranged for Ava to come in for a screen test. That first test did not go especially well. Her North Carolina accent was so thick that studio staff reportedly struggled to understand her. But MGM executives decided her looks alone justified the investment, and in 1941, at 18 years old, Ava signed a studio contract and left behind everything she had ever known for Hollywood. Studio publicity later branded her with the sweeping nickname "the world's most beautiful animal," a label meant as a compliment that Ava came to resent over time, feeling it reduced her to a decorative object rather than someone actually trying to build a career as an actress. MGM immediately went to work reshaping her. Months of speech coaching to soften her Southern accent, basic acting lessons, and a steady stream of small, mostly decorative roles designed to put her face in front of audiences. Her film debut came in 1941 in a minor part in Babes on Broadway, and for the next several years she moved through a string of largely forgettable roles. But her striking green eyes and natural screen presence were impossible to overlook, and industry insiders increasingly began whispering that MGM had stumbled onto something genuinely rare. Ava herself later said that during those early years she felt like a piece of furniture the studio was slowly rearranging, present in scene after scene without ever really being asked what she actually wanted her career to look like. Her real breakthrough arrived in 1946 with The Killers, a moody film noir in which she played a femme fatale opposite Burt Lancaster, a performance that finally convinced critics there was real talent underneath the image MGM had spent years selling. From there, her career built steadily through a run of significant films including The Hucksters, Showboat, and The Barefoot Contessa, each one reinforcing her reputation as one of the most compelling screen presences of her generation. In 1953, she earned her only Academy Award nomination for Mogambo, filmed on location in Africa alongside Clark Gable and Grace Kelly, a production that also introduced her to the kind of adventurous, unconventional life she increasingly gravitated toward once the cameras stopped rolling. Even at the height of her success, Ava privately remained convinced she had been hired mainly for her looks rather than genuine acting ability, once saying flatly that she never really considered herself a true actress, just someone who happened to photograph well. She once told a reporter, only half joking, that the studio could have propped a mannequin in most of her early roles and audiences would hardly have noticed the difference. a comment that revealed just how little ownership she felt over the image MGM had built around her. Behind the scenes, MGM ran the same tightly controlled operation over Ava's public image that the studio system applied to nearly every contract star of that era, deciding which stories about her romantic life ever reached print, and which ones were simply buried. Publicity departments routinely staged her public appearances alongside male co-stars purely to generate favorable headlines, regardless of what was actually happening in her private life, a practice so standard across the industry that most stars of the era simply accepted it as the cost of fame. Ava later said she stopped being surprised by any of it fairly early on, since the studio treated her private life less like her own business and more like raw material for whatever narrative sold the most tickets that particular month. It did not take long for that beauty to open a door inside the studio itself, and the very first door it opened led straight into trouble. Not long after arriving on the MGM lot, 19-year-old Ava caught the attention of Mickey Rooney, at the time the single highest-paid actor in the country and the studio's biggest box office draw. Rooney became instantly infatuated and pursued her relentlessly despite the studio's strong objections, worried a marriage would damage his clean-cut, boyish public image, since much of his box office pull rested on playing wholesome all-American teenagers in the popular Andy Hardy pictures. Executives reportedly tried every trick available to slow the relationship down, but Rooney, already one of the most stubborn young stars in the business, refused to back off. Their courtship moved at a dizzying pace, and the two were married within months, with Ava barely out of her teens and still adjusting to a life thousands of miles from the North Carolina farmland she had grown up on. Ava later wrote that she entered that marriage genuinely innocent, both in experience and in what she actually understood about the man she was marrying. She had no real idea, she admitted decades later, exactly how far Rooney's reputation for infidelity actually reached. Friends who knew them both at the time later said Ava had walked onto the lot expecting Hollywood marriages to work roughly the way they did back home in North Carolina, and that the gap between that expectation and the reality of life with one of the country's most pursued young stars left her genuinely disoriented for months. The marriage moved fast and collapsed just as quickly. By Ava's own account, Rooney's wandering eye never slowed down, not even in the earliest days of their relationship, and she described discovering the true scope of his behavior with genuine shock. One of the most painful moments she later described happened while she was recovering in the hospital from an appendectomy. According to her, Rooney used her absence as an opportunity to be unfaithful, a betrayal that struck her as especially cruel given the timing. What had looked from the outside like a glamorous young Hollywood pairing fell apart entirely within about a year, with the couple divorcing in May of 1943. A date Ava would later call one of the hardest of her entire life, since it landed on the very same day her own mother passed away from cancer. She later said that losing her mother and formally ending her first marriage on the same day left her feeling for a long stretch afterward like she had no stable ground left anywhere in her life, neither the home she had come from nor the one Hollywood had built for her. If you're finding this story as gripping as we are, take a second to subscribe to Old Tapes. We uncover real stories like this every single week. After Rooney, Ava spent time involved with billionaire aviator and film producer Howard Hughes, a connection that came and went for years without ever becoming a serious romance on her end. In her later memoir, she was blunt about her feelings toward Hughes, writing plainly that she never actually loved him despite being genuinely grateful for one specific act of generosity. When her mother was dying, Hughes personally covered her medical expenses, a kindness Ava said she never forgot. But her memoir also described deeply troubling attitudes she witnessed from Hughes on the subject of race, attitudes she found repellent enough that they permanently shaped how she remembered him, regardless of his occasional generosity. Hughes, already known throughout Hollywood for his obsessive approach to the women he pursued, reportedly showered her with expensive gifts and repeated marriage proposals over the years, none of which she ever seriously considered, later writing that no amount of wealth could make up for the parts of his character she found genuinely hard to overlook. Her second marriage came just 2 years after her first ended, this time to celebrated bandleader and clarinetist Artie Shaw, one of the most famous musicians in the country and, by most accounts, one of the more intellectually formidable men in the entertainment business. Shaw had already been married 3 times before he ever met Ava, a pattern that in hindsight suggested a man who simply struggled to sustain a relationship for very long. And he would go on to marry a total of 8 times over the course of his life, which places Ava's own painful experience with him inside a much longer pattern that had little to do with her personally. The two married in October of 1945 after a whirlwind courtship, with Ava 22 and Shaw 35. From the outside it looked like a genuine love match between 2 accomplished, glamorous people. Behind closed doors, by Ava's own later account, the relationship quickly turned into something far more damaging. She described Shaw as intellectually domineering in a way that steadily wore down her confidence, repeatedly making her feel inferior and unintelligent next to him. In her own words, she came to describe him as a different kind of bully, someone who constantly chipped away at her sense of self-worth. The strain was severe enough that Ava began smoking heavily and drinking regularly throughout the marriage, describing herself as deeply unhappy for much of it. What followed is one of the more remarkable and lesser-known chapters of her entire life. Convinced by Shaw that she lacked real intelligence, Ava eventually decided to take a formal IQ test purely to settle the question for herself. The results came back showing a genuinely high score, clear proof that the insecurity Shaw had planted in her had no real basis in fact. She later described that moment as both empowering and strangely freeing, finally putting to rest doubts about her own mind that had followed her for years. The marriage still ended in divorce in October of 1946, with Ava saying Shaw left her for another woman within roughly a year of their wedding. It was in the aftermath of these 2 difficult marriages that Ava Gardner met the man she would later describe, without hesitation, as the true love of her life, singer and actor Frank Sinatra. The two had actually crossed paths years earlier while she was still married to Rooney, but nothing developed between them until they reconnected at a party in 1949. At the time, Sinatra was still married to his first wife Nancy, though by most accounts the marriage was already deeply strained. Ava and Frank found they could not stay away from each other, and despite both of their efforts at discretion, the affair quickly became one of the most talked about open secrets in all of Hollywood. In her memoir, Ava described knowing almost immediately from their very first real date that what she felt for Sinatra was entirely different from anything she had experienced before, a connection intense enough to reroute the entire direction of her life. Their courtship was, by nearly every account, exactly as intense and unpredictable as the public imagined. Sinatra finalized his divorce from Nancy, and the two married in November of 1951, with Ava in her late 20s and Frank in his mid-30s, both of them already major stars whose combined fame made the wedding front-page news across the country. Newspaper photographers reportedly camped outside the small ceremony for days beforehand, and the couple was ultimately forced to slip in and out through service entrances just to get married with any privacy at all. Sinatra's career was actually at something of a low point when the two finally married, his singing career having cooled noticeably from its earlier peak, and some biographers have suggested that added career pressure, layered on top of intense media attention aimed at the couple from day one, only made an already volatile relationship harder to hold together. The early passion between them was undeniable, but according to Ava's own later account, the relationship was unstable almost from the beginning, marked by jealousy, heavy drinking on both sides, and frequent explosive arguments neither of them seemed able to control. Ava also revealed in her memoir that during their relationship she became pregnant twice, and given the intense strain the couple was already under at the time, she chose not to continue either pregnancy, decisions she described as among the most difficult and emotionally costly of her entire life. Even before marriage, their courtship had already become the stuff of Hollywood legend for its sheer intensity. Ava later described one particular night that captured the reckless energy of their early relationship perfectly, a late-night drive between Palm Springs and the nearby town of Indio during which the two of them, caught up entirely in the moment, ended up firing a pair of revolvers Sinatra kept in the car at passing street lamps and storefront signs along an empty desert road, an episode that became one of the half-mythical stories people who knew them still tell. It was reckless behavior by any reasonable measure, but to those close to the couple, it captured exactly the kind of untamed chemistry that drew them together and, eventually, helped tear them apart. During and after her marriage to Sinatra, Ava increasingly found herself drawn to Europe. eventually settling for a time in Madrid, Spain, where she built a vivid social circle that included author Ernest Hemingway, with whom she developed a close and lasting friendship. Hemingway was reportedly captivated by her fearless, restless spirit, and the two spent considerable time together during her years in Spain, bonding over a shared love of bullfighting, late nights, and a mutual refusal to settle into anything resembling an ordinary life. That period also produced one of her most celebrated later performances, in the 1964 film The Night of the Iguana, directed by John Huston and filmed on location in Mexico, a production almost as famous for its chaotic, hard-drinking atmosphere behind the scenes as for the finished film itself. As her marriage to Sinatra deteriorated under the weight of jealousy and constant conflict, Ava revealed something in her memoir that shocked even longtime followers of the couple. While still involved with Sinatra, she had also been secretly seeing actor Robert Mitchum, a connection that reportedly began after the two grew close working together, one she described in her memoir as genuinely intense, unlike some of the more painful or complicated relationships detailed elsewhere in the book. When she finally worked up the nerve to tell Mitchum the truth, that she was also involved with Sinatra, Mitchum reportedly ended things with her immediately, explaining that a confrontation with Sinatra over her affections was simply a fight he had no interest in risking, given Sinatra's well-known temper and connections. Ava and Frank kept trying to salvage the marriage for years afterward, but it finally and permanently ended in divorce in July of 1957. Even so, the bond between them never fully disappeared. Sinatra remained close to her for the rest of her life, and decades later, as her health began to fail, he quietly stepped in to help cover her medical costs without ever publicly discussing it. Perhaps the most difficult relationship Ava described in her memoir involved actor George the 100th Scott, whom she dated for a period years after the Sinatra divorce. Publicly, the two were seen as an appealing couple. Privately, by Ava's own detailed and deeply personal account, the relationship involved genuine physical violence on Scott's part, particularly when he had been drinking heavily. She described specific, frightening incidents in which Scott became physically aggressive during arguments, moments she said left her genuinely afraid of what might happen next. She wrote that she began quietly making mental notes of exits in whatever room they happened to be in together, a habit she said never fully left her even years after the relationship had ended. It was, by her own telling, one of the most painful and dangerous relationships of her entire life, and one she rarely discussed publicly until she finally chose to include it in her memoir decades later, wanting the complete truth of her life recorded honestly rather than filtered through Hollywood's usual glamorized version of events. The relationship was also notably on again, off again over several years, with the two separating and reconciling more than once before finally parting ways for good. A pattern Ava herself later reflected on with clear-eyed regret, acknowledging she had walked back into a genuinely harmful situation more than once before finally choosing to leave it behind for good. Through all of these turbulent years, Ava's closest friend and confidant was fellow MGM star Lana Turner, a woman who, by pure coincidence, had previously been romantically involved with several of the very same men Ava would later date, including both Artie Shaw and, for a period, Sinatra himself. Because of that shared history, Turner had first-hand insight into the darker sides of these men that Ava had not yet discovered on her own, and she reportedly tried more than once to steer her friend away from repeating the same painful patterns. When Ava confided in Turner about her growing feelings for Sinatra, Turner reportedly urged her directly not to go through with it, drawing on her own earlier experience with him. Ava later admitted in her memoir that she wished she had listened, though she also acknowledged that some lessons in life can only be learned the hard way, through direct experience rather than the warnings of others, however well-intentioned those warnings might be. By the late 1980s, the glamour and applause that had defined so much of Ava Gardner's life had largely faded. She was living quietly in London, her film career long behind her, struggling financially, and drinking heavily as she worked through the isolation of her later years. Health problems compounded the difficulty of that period significantly. She had undergone a hysterectomy years earlier out of fear of developing the same uterine condition that had taken her mother, and by the mid-1980s she was also managing emphysema, largely the result of decades of heavy smoking, and had suffered 2 separate strokes that left her partially paralyzed and largely confined to her bed, cared for mainly by her longtime housekeeper and her devoted Welsh corgi. Visitors from that period described a woman who could still summon flashes of the same sharp humor that had defined her for decades, even while acknowledging in quieter moments how far her circumstances had drifted from the glamour the public still associated with her name. Despite the physical limits these health struggles imposed, Ava remained determined to finish her memoir, working through recording sessions with journalist Peter Evans in short stretches whenever her strength and focus allowed, refusing to let her declining health stop her from finally telling the complete story, driven by the same financial pressure and the same refusal to part with her remaining jewelry that had first pushed her toward the entire project. The resulting memoir, published after her death, offered a remarkably candid look at a life that had, from the outside, always seemed impossibly glamorous. Readers discovered a woman who had survived infidelity, public heartbreak, private violence, and deep personal insecurity, all while maintaining, on screen and in public, one of the most magnetic and celebrated personas in the entire history of Hollywood. Ava Gardner passed away from pneumonia in her London apartment on January 25, 1990, at 67 years old, having also been diagnosed with lupus in her final years. Her body was brought home to Smithfield, North Carolina, where more than 3,000 people came to pay their respects before her burial beside her parents. Frank Sinatra, the man she always called the love of her life, personally arranged for the very first floral arrangement to arrive at the funeral home, one quiet final gesture from a relationship that had been shaped by and had shaped decades of passion, heartbreak, and enduring loyalty. Today, Ava Gardner's legacy is preserved in her home state through the Ava Gardner Museum in Smithfield, North Carolina, which holds costumes, personal letters, and film memorabilia tracing her path from a small tobacco farm to global stardom. Film historians continue to rank her among the defining screen presences of Hollywood's golden age, pointing not just to her striking looks but to the genuine vulnerability and depth she brought to her later performances, qualities that took years and considerable personal hardship for critics to fully recognize. Ava Gardner spent her entire career being sold by Hollywood as an object of desire, a face and a figure built for the screen. What her memoir ultimately revealed was something far more complicated, a woman who survived genuine hardship, made painful choices under enormous pressure, and carried private wounds far deeper than anything the studio publicity machine ever let the public glimpse. So here's what I want to know from you. Of everything you just heard, which relationship do you think shaped Ava Gardner the most? And do you think Hollywood's golden age glamorized relationships that today we would recognize as genuinely unhealthy? Tell me in the comments. Subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next one.